when you, for example, speak about, and this is really interesting, and this, I think it's also an aspect of many other colonial encounters, whereby the new, usually European colonizers, when they encounter natives, are trying to make sense of these natives by making them fit into some kind of a framework that is familiar to them.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. So Yaron, thank you so much for joining me on The No Show.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So can we first introduce you to the audience? Talk to me about how you found yourself researching sort of Jewish culture and Zionism, and what was the route to studying this?
I actually started as a filmmaker in the United States. I went to college there to become a filmmaker, but discovered along that process in the very, very beginning that I'm not particularly well suited to work in film, and the creative process was a bit confusing to me, and not particularly stable. So I decided to continue my graduate studies, or go into graduate studies to study about Israel, particularly literature, something that I was always interested in, and did a PhD in Hebrew literature at Brandeis University in the United States. And from then on, continued to teach Hebrew Israeli literature, in particular in the United States and now in the United Kingdom.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, this transition from being a filmmaker to being an academic, was there anything that you could borrow from the filmmaking experience, or being a filmmaker to becoming an academic? Were there any tools that you could benefit from in that experience previous to being an academic?
I don't know if I can identify the kinds of investigative and other practices from film, but what I did find, which is also a comment on the state of culture today, is that my expertise and training in film studies, and which included also film analysis, eventually also became part of my academic career, in that I include and write a lot about cinema as well as literature, because I find that both students and the public is increasingly more interested in visual art and visual media rather than textual media or written media. What I mean to say that, it's the old cliche of people not reading so much books anymore, and not interested so much in literature, and more engaged in visual culture, such as the films, television series in particular lately. So I found myself using this earlier expertise of mine more and more in recent years by writing on cinema, particularly Israeli cinema, which has become really an interesting national cinema in the last 2 decades, and also an interesting television industry with the proliferation of streaming platforms and the very big, relatively speaking, big role that Israeli television production has in it.
So this is very interesting for me, because I want to I want to sort of, I want to try to avoid the politics of it all, but sometimes when we're discussing these things, it's very difficult to, um, because, you know, Zionism is, it's too intertwined with politics. And so when we're talking about the media and film, I'll have to sort of ask the question, how much influence what's the relationship between films and films, Israeli films, with sort of the political arm of Zionism?
This is a great question, and I think a very important one for Israeli cinema and television production, maybe in different ways, and I'll explain what I mean. In Israel, because the country has been a small country which doesn't or cannot support films financially, that is, in a country of Israel's size, it is generally not particularly economical to make films. You can't really make a living making films. And so the state has set up an apparatus whereby it underwrites, it gives subventions to films, and you have to apply to film councils in order to get your film script funded and produced. Although these film councils are nominated by politicians, but they're nominated for a very long time, and they are not, the nominees are not beholden to the politicians who nominate them. And so you tend to have, so these funding bodies are politically independent. However, as it is in many sort of Western orientated liberal countries, artists and, people connected to the arts tend to be what in politics we call left-leaning and liberal. And therefore, the projects that they choose to support usually tend to be reflective of these political views. So you tend to have a lot of films made in Israel that support the Arab, the Palestinians, better relations between Arabs and Jews, films that expose the ethnic inequalities within the Jewish community in Israel and other ills of the culture in ways that are particularly pronounced. Interestingly, I would say in 1991, there was an attempt by right-leaning activists and politicians to establish a counter kind of school to encourage the making of films that would, and television programs that would give expression to other political views. The success has been mixed, and most of the films that come out of Israel so far, you asked about politics, reflect these kinds of Western-leaning liberal sort of politics. However, interestingly enough, and I've recently written about this, there is also a tendency by these kinds of politically identified filmmakers to try to, what I would call, whitewash some of Israel's less popular and less just political directions in past decades in ways that can be very problematic. So I would say initially, my initial answer to your question was this sort of a bit complicated answer.
Yeah, I mean, you did a great job in sort of trying to unpack it. It sounds like a very complex situation. Now there's a few interesting things there. You said there's a whitewashing of, the oppressive element, or, as you said, the less just, depending on whichever side of the world you're on and how you want to see it. And when we're looking at that, what are some of the examples of this whitewashing that can be problematic?
This is a great question because I'll give an example by talking about a film that has made quite an impact in the world, and that was Ari Folman's Waltzing with Bashir. It's an animated documentary that in which the director, Ari Folman, is processing his experience as a soldier in Israel's war in Lebanon in '82, and his indirect participation in the massacre in the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila by Lebanese Christian militia that were assisted by the Israeli army. And he was witness to it, and the film processes his anxiety and his what people have been calling perpetrators' trauma. And the film has been very popular in the world. And when I speak about whitewashing, I'm speaking about an aspect of the film that presents the offending Israeli soldier, that is the director and his avatar in the film, as victims of a situation where there are really obvious other victims that are not really focused on, that is the Palestinians. And so the entire film talks about his difficulties as a soldier, and the fact that he is sort of manipulated by his own government and used by his own government to perpetuate these crimes against the Palestinian people. And I suppose in some ways, it may be a bit unfair to say this, but in some ways, you can't dictate directors, artists, what to write about, what to express, and how to create. But there is an aspect of the film that presents him, the protagonist, and his friends, the Israeli soldier, his friends, as victims. Yes, of course, they were victims of their own co-option within a very forceful and manipulative Israeli political system. But their presentation as victims in such a way, in comparison to the relative, much worse predicament of the Palestinians, has problematic aspects from sort of a moral perspective. Again, this question is even more complex because we're talking about a work of art, and we are sort of demanding that the artist adhere to some kind of a moral code, which I don't know that's even possible. It's akin to questions we ask ourselves about the personal lives of politicians and artists, and whether we should, for example, hold these historical figures, as well as figures in the present, to some kind of a moral code, which is completely impossible, and whether we should line up the artistic message with the conduct of a person's personal life. So these are really interesting questions that I don't have a solution to, but I think these kinds of films of the, like the one by Ari Folman, Waltzing with Bashir, raise to the surface and make complicated and also interesting because of that.
There's an issue I have here, and I'm sure many people listening would ask, because, or would raise, and this issue is, you present a very, coherent argument about can we question the morals of the director and the artist, but then it's clear that there are double standards that exist in the world, and if we were to see a movie tomorrow that speaks of let's say the trauma that one of Hitler's generals had experienced in his life, because he had to, follow this evil regime's, political gambit. And he was involved in the massacre of many, many Jews. I struggle to believe that this film would even be allowed to air, because there is a double standard when it comes to looking at sort of the Jewish identity. The Jewish identity, when it comes to being I suppose, well, in movies anyway, when it comes to being the victim, is obviously there, and justifiably so, because of the trauma and because of like the massacre of however many, people in the camps. However, when we flip the coin and we look at the Jewish soldier, the Israeli soldier, who's responsible for the supporting and massacre of countless Palestinians in these camps, there, we say, can we judge their moral code? So to me, it just seems like there's a double standard there. What's your position on it, or do you think that double standard exists?
I don't think it's particularly a double standard as much as it is a question of degree. I think we're talking about problematic behavior in both cases, but of course the degree to which they differ, I think the key issue here is the degree in which they differ. And so, and that degree, I think, is key to discussing these two cases. And it is true, though, that here we're going into politics, an area that I'm not particularly an expert in.
No, I try. I mean, forget the politics, the political aspect of it. From like a viewer, like from a viewership perspective, from an audience perspective, from like a creative perspective, we allow for this freedom to explore the emotions of an Israeli soldier who's responsible for killing Palestinians, but I don't think, but I don't think we will allow that for looking at the trauma of one of Hitler's men. I don't think we'd allow that.
I actually there is actually a change in the approach to Nazis, and particularly I know from Holocaust research, the children and grandchildren of Nazis. And in Holocaust research, for example, there is a direction now that there is research now that looks at and exposes, discusses the trauma of German citizens in the Third Reich, and the kinds of pressure they're under to cooperate and to participate. And so there's also a shift in research about these kinds of things. There is a direction towards trying to understand this in a better way. And I think that would also, that's also expressed in the kinds of things I was talking about with respect to Israeli soldiers. But I think it's really very important to make the distinction of degree that I referred to, because it makes a lot of difference. But in general, I would say you're talking about double standards. The world is full of double standards. This is not unique. We all know this. And I'm not saying this is a good thing. I'm not sanctioning it. And I think we're making constant progress towards trying to eliminate these double standards. But, we're talking about a global society that is completely unequal on so many levels and in so many places. Again, that does not exempt us from trying to eliminate these kinds of double standards closer to home and with respect to us. And when I say us, I mean each and every one of us, with respect to what we're talking here with my expertise. This is Israeli culture. So yes, of course, there is a double standard, but I do think also that things are changing slowly. And even this conversation between the two of us, and again, I'm referring to an article I recently published precisely about this double standard. Then there is a greater willingness to discuss this, to understand this. And I should also say, by the way, this is something that's coming to the attention of people outside of Israel, but it has been a tendency within Israeli culture, almost from its very beginning, to kind of probe this double standard, raise it to the surface, and discuss it publicly. There is, I think, I will mention something that is known to most people who are familiar with Israeli culture. There is a famous writer, S. Yizhar, who wrote already in the 1940s and about Israel's 1948 war, which is in Israel is called War of Independence. And he speaks precisely about this double standard of Israeli soldiers in this nascent nation, in a forming army, and their relationship to Palestinians as Jews. Mm-hmm. There is already a discussion about this sort of double standard there within Israeli culture. So within Israeli culture, this is something that has been discussed and has been publicly aired and dealt with artistically repeatedly, which is really interesting. And it's only now beginning to sort of come out of the culture and be discussed wider afield, I would say.
So this is a really interesting intersection, because I want to go on to the topic of colonialism that you look at, and you say it's unfair to describe or to look at Zionism through this colonial critique. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, I don't think I would use the word unfair. It's not a question of fairness. Mm-hmm. I think it's just problematic. It's incorrect. I wouldn't say unfair. I wouldn't use that word. And I think it's an important distinction. Again, I'm a researcher. I'm an academic. I am trying to get closer. I'm not going to use the word truth because, of course, we know this. There's no such thing. But I would. What I do professionally is to try and understand and get closer to genuine expressions, to original sources, to sources of information that can give a picture that would be as accurate as possible. Mm-hmm. This is, I would define in this very sort of long, complicated way the word which people very conveniently use as truth. Okay, but so this is what I attempt to do. And so, with respect to your question about colonialism, again. First, the first thing I want to say is that when Zionism developed, colonialism was considered, of course, in Europe, by people who used it to their advantage as something positive and something beneficial, certainly to themselves, but also to the people who colonized. This is the way people thought about it. The paradigm was presented that way, back in the fin de siècle, in the imperial period. It is viewed very differently now. for obvious and for obvious reasons, which I support. We're talking about exploitation, we're talking about subjugation, we're talking about control, we're talking about atrocities. So absolutely, I agree with the shift of the attitude towards colonialism that has happened throughout the 20th century. So when the Zionists tried to take their movement forward and develop it, they used this paradigm to their advantage, even though they were not a defined political European entity. They were not a state. They didn't have the powers of the state, the apparatus of the state, army, administration, financial resources at their disposal in the same way that England had, that France had, that Germany had, and other countries before them. If you talk about, other sort of empires in the past. So from a very fundamental perspective, this is very, very different. We're talking about a very precarious minority within Europe, a minority that was for many centuries religious, but became more and more sort of secular, to use general terminology. And that minority tried to emulate a paradigm and a framework that was completely alien to its very nature, if you think about it. But it was very convenient to do so. And I think part of the genius of the political the political framer of the movement, Theodor Herzl, was to fake this kind of colonial paradigm, to speak in the name of Jews as if they were England or France or Germany or any of these strong European political entities. That was the genius of Herzl, and one of the reasons why he was so successful in promoting the idea of Zionism within the Zionist community. It was primarily successful within the Zionist community, not so much outside of it, because the other countries, in the world, in Europe, understood that Jews were not in the same level at all. So from that political perspective, initially, there's really no analogy between Zionism and colonialism. At the same time, we're talking about a European group of people who came to the Near East to settle it, and in the name of their superior European culture, and they saw themselves in many respects as people who bring progress to an area, to a region that was technologically, at least, more inferior to the countries they came from. And so that, of course, is very colonial. At the same time, unlike many colonies in the what's called now the majority world outside of Europe, because Jews had no power, because Jews had no army, because Jews had no money, from that perspective, comparatively speaking, they couldn't grab land in Palestine. They had to buy it. They had to legally buy it from landowners. Now you can look at it from a material sort of Marxist way and say, well, we call this land grabbing. You have wealthy people who are coming to a region where people are not very well organized and don't really understand the forces against them, and they sell their land cheaply to people who come from the outside with a lot of money and have other intentions for it. Absolutely. So you see, the more we talk about it, the more complex it becomes. Again,
if I can interject here, so there are a few things that you pointed to that are very interesting. And again, they lend themselves well to real life cases that we see today. I want to get into sort of the Herzl aspect after, but let us first unpack this sort of land grabbing thing. So in the case of, China, we have China now with a superior economy, like it's growing rapidly. It's still, it's set to outpace the US, and they're going to be the leaders at some point. Everybody sort of agrees on that. When China enters Africa and when China enters Latin America and creates all these agreements, we look at China, and the Western world looks at China and says, "Oh, you guys are colonizing," and it's no. Perhaps that's just the lens that the West looks at the world, is through this colonial lens, and so they look at China as if they're just grabbing land, when in reality China is developing the infrastructure of many of these countries for those people in return for X. There's a transaction there. Now, when we look at the case of Israel and we look at the land grab there, when some people may argue that that's how they managed to control so much of the territory, which is again, this is very contested. James Barr's book, Lords of the Desert, contests this concept like aggressively. But again, if we just stick to this point about it being a land grab, is that not, very similar to what many of the colonies or the colonial powers in the past did too? Because essentially, it wasn't always by fire. It was sometimes through just having the money and having the resources.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct. But again, you are taking the conversation to areas, again, that I'm less of an expert in.
Mm-hmm.
I understand it's more interesting.
No, it's not. This isn't. Sorry, just to. I'm not like the point is. This isn't purely factual stuff based on your research and primarily on your research. What we want to do is to have a broad conversation where we give the academic the freedom to explore these ideas, through the framework of their research, but have their own opinion. And it's, this is one of the things that we want to steer away from, this concept of like, I'm an expert in this and I'm only going to speak about this. We want you to sort of, have an opinion.
Yes, no, I understand that. I understand that. But I'm more comfortable speaking about things I know a bit more about. But again, the examples that you're bringing are excellent in the sense that they are helping me prove precisely the point that I'm trying to make about the complexity and the nuance differences of the Zionist case vis-a-vis colonialism. I think the colonial paradigm is useful, interesting, provocative, but what I have spent doing most of my career is to look precisely at those parts, those points, those aspects of this comparison where the some of the differences lie. And I'll give you an example by referring to the first study the first book I've published, and which we talked about earlier, that is called Orientalism and the Hebrew Imagination. And one of the things I was trying to do there is to, within the colonial paradigm, to look at cultural affinities between early Zionists and the local Palestinians, the Arabs of Palestine at the time. When you, for example, speak about, and this is really interesting, and this, I think it's also an aspect of many other colonial encounters, whereby the new, usually European colonizers, when they encounter natives, are trying to make sense of these natives by making them fit into some kind of a framework that is familiar to them. So if we look, for example, at the encounter between Europeans and Native Americans in North America, there were some of these particularly Christian evangelical Europeans who regarded the Indians as members of the lost tribe of Israel, for example. There were people who were thinking about them like that. Now, if you think about it, it's so fanciful that it's really sort of perplexing. I mean, how did you come up with this? But you have here the meeting between two cultures who have absolutely no or very little frameworks of reference to relate to one another. And so the white Christians are using paradigms that they know, concepts that they know, and impose them on these new people. One of the things that Zionists did in Palestine was something similar. They were trying to look at the cultural affinities between them and Arabs. And one of the great points of contention and one of the key aspects of modern anti-Semitism that did not allow Jews to sort of comfortably become part of a nationalizing Europe in the 19th century was the fact that they were othered. They were sort of the original big other of Europe, and called Oriental, called Arab-like, and signs of difference between them and Germans, French, English, physical differences and linguistic differences and other differences, cultural differences were attempted to be sort of constructed that would differentiate between them and Europeans. And one of the biggest differences that was a challenge for their assimilation into European Christian white culture was the fact that they were perceived as other and Oriental and sort of Arab-like. And so what some of these early Zionists did, they leveraged this problematic aspect, and by coming to the Middle East said, oh, well, let's use this to connect with Arabs, to connect with Palestinians, to create some kind of a bridge between us and them, and use this thing which was problematic in white Christian Europe as a point of reference, bridging, affinity, connection to the local Palestinians. It was a minority. It was sort of a trend for a very short time, but it was an intriguing one. And my early research that I've mentioned about Orientalism looks at this phenomenon and try to understand it and put it in the greater context of being able to discuss it.
That's very interesting. To use sort of this otherness, but of course you mentioned that it was very short-lived. Perhaps it wasn't even very successful. That's why it was short-lived. But back to this point of sort of, I'm just trying to understand your point of view about, you said Zionism didn't have a state, which we agree on. It didn't have a state. So we can't look at it in the same way that the Spanish colonized Latin America, and we can't look at it in other similar ways. However, it's very interesting because the Zionists didn't come in a vacuum. They came with the support of financial support from the Americans. There was a lot of financial support. There was a lot of media support. There was a lot of political support. When we look at this thing, it wasn't done in a vacuum. It was done against the backdrop of the British and the Americans sort of in a race to grab, whatever they can in the Middle East. Because this is when the Middle East was sort of becoming, it started to become clear that there was a lot of oil in the Middle East in that sort of time. And when we look at that, and you borrow the support from these former colonial states, or very much colonial states at the time, does that not by extension make you in the same, I'll put you in the same bracket as a colonial power.
Yeah. I don't have a big argument with you, except to set some facts straight. And those would be that in the very beginning of Zionism, there was relatively little support for the movement, even within Jewish circles. Certainly was not the support that international support that Zionists hope to have. For example, one of the interesting things about Theodor Herzl is that he was a great sort of political conjurer. He interestingly believed in the same kind of anti-Semitic legend that Jews control the world and Jews have a lot of money. And it's true that there were some very wealthy Jewish individuals, such as the Rothschilds, but they were not in anybody's hands. And so they certainly were not participating in any kind of cabal, a Jewish cabal, coordinating with other Jews around the world. They had their own financial interests and family interests and worked for those primarily. What the fascinating thing about Herzl, particularly, is that he seems to have believed in this sort of anti-Semitic legend, and in the name of this alleged sort of Jewish power, went to the German Kaiser, tried to meet with the Ottoman Sultan, and English political politicians to leverage sort of the Zionist case and to help and to gain the support of these people. By and large, he was utterly unsuccessful in doing this, because the people that he went to see may have been anti-Semites, but they were not fools. And they knew that at that early stage, there was no Jewish power, there was no Jewish money, and there was no interest for these people, for these countries to support the Jewish case. Certainly the Ottomans didn't think so, the Germans didn't think so, and the English didn't think so. Things changed a bit after the British came into the region and received the mandate for Palestine in 1917. They changed again. Again, I'm not a political scientist, and this is all sort of from general readings I've been doing. There's an interesting book that was published a few years ago, A Line in the Sand.
A Line in the Sand, yeah.
Yeah, that talks about the politics behind the Sykes-Picot, 1916 Sykes-Picot agreement between France and England to divide the Middle East, which we see today, we know, with the sort of angular ruler, ruler cut shapes of Jordan, for example, of Syria, where all of these countries, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, the Gulf states, were created by France and England during that time and divided between them. At least the thesis of the I forget who the writer is of
James Barr as well.
Yeah, James Barr. The thesis is that the support of the English government in a Jewish national home in Palestine that came out in 1917 was a ploy by the British to subvert the world's gaze from their naked material interests in Arab oil. Okay, so they would say, okay, to sort of cover our more instrumental tracks with respect to the Arab oil, we will give this persecuted minority this sort of charter for Palestine, and that will take off some of the more problematic trampling of other human rights and other the interests of other sort of communities in the Middle East. Again, I don't have access to materials that made Barr formulate his opinion, so I can't opine about it.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so again, the more we go into it, the more complicated it is.
Of course,
but the more interesting it is. I think that's why I think that's why people have been repeatedly so interested in the story of the Middle East, Israel, and the Arab countries in particular, because, it is expressive of many other tensions in the world, between cultures, between politics and polities and trends.
With regards to culture and film and sort of a lens that you're familiar with when it comes to Israel, do you wish to see sort of, because you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that it's sort of overseen by if correct me if I'm wrong, but sort of the media or film production is overseen by some political there's some political oversight to it, and considering that Israel for the past however many years has been much more right wing than it's not been a very sort of left leaning country, and it's been very nationalistic, very right wing. Benjamin Netanyahu has been extremely on the right, etc. Do you wish, as a former creative yourself, as a filmmaker, do you wish to see more openness when it comes to Israeli film, to look at, for example, the film that you mentioned with this sort of this Israeli soldier who's part of the massacre? Do you wish to see films where you show the more raw side of Israel, as opposed to sort of looking at things through, a traumatized lens? Do you want to see do you want more critique of Israel in film? Do you think that would be beneficial to Israel internally, the Zionist movement internally, or do you think that the Zionism has to use this nationalistic, voice for it to be successful?
Yeah, again, I want to repeat what I tried to say before. I agree with your assessment of Israel politically, but I also think there's an interesting divide between the parliamentary politics of the country and the cultural, particularly cinematic output that is supported by funds that the state makes available to filmmakers. Again, there is a disconnect, because most of the people who sit on these money granting bodies are what we would call left-leaning and liberal. Okay, so from this perspective, they don't express the politics and the views of the coalition governments in Israel, certainly in the Netanyahu era. And we have seen, interestingly, sort of clashes between the Minister of Culture for Netanyahu, who balked at some of these productions and the dissemination around the world of what she considered to be views that are detrimental to Israel and tarnish the image of Israel abroad. So there is a divide between the governmental policies and the money that they make available. They don't control directly. There is a law that mandates the amount of money that needs to be given to the arts, and the politicians cannot dictate in many respects. They can, of course, in some indirect ways, but for example, when there's a festival in Israel, and an arts festival, and the funds for the art festival is coming from government funds, the Minister of Culture and the government can say, well, we don't like some of the lineup that you have. And it has been a problematic point of contention during the Netanyahu years, many times. But with respect to cinema particularly, there is a law mandating the amount of money that needs to be given to it. It hasn't been touched yet, and the people who are in charge of giving that money are not politicians.
Okay.
And so that results in very different kinds of films that are being produced, and they're completely not right-leaning, nationalistic, jingoistic. However, having said that, I think that some of these filmmakers are operating in what I would say, very cautiously, but I would still say it. I would use the Marxist term of I forget it right now. It's sort of a cognitive dissonance, whereby they have, their idea is to criticize Israeli culture, to expose some of its fault lines, some of its problems. But false consciousness is what I wanted to say. They seem to be operating under sort of a false consciousness that they're doing this, where in fact they are unable to go deeper still to speak about some of the fundamental problematics of the Israeli situation, especially vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And I gave an example with Walson with Bashir, where I do not doubt the anguish and the anxiety and the trauma that the director, Ari Folman, is expressing in this film. I do not doubt the genuineness of it. I do not doubt that he, needed to go to therapy, whatever. I really do not doubt it. At the same time, and we talked about questions of degree, okay? At the same time, there is a far worse situation and a far worse trauma that is that of the Palestinians, about which Israeli cinema does not speak to the same degree. You can come and say, well, this is not the experience of Israeli filmmakers. This should be the experience of Palestinian filmmakers. And there is a truth to it, of course. I mean, a filmmaker, a creator, an artist, we probably would not feel comfortable, or will probably feel the falseness of a creator who is trying to express the anguish of another person, not themselves. Okay, fine. I understand that. But there is, in fact, some increasingly more and more Israeli films that are made by Israeli Palestinians who are trying to do precisely that. This again, they're very few, very far between, and they don't get the same exposure as films by Israeli Jews get, not to the same. I'm not sure why. This is something that it's an interesting question. I'm not sure why.
I mean, there could be any reason for that, but partly because of the fact that, I'm pretty sure many Palestinians would be too scared to do something along those lines. But I mean, this is a very interesting field and an interesting area of study. And for people that are interested to learn more about your research, where can they find you online?
Well, I have some basic information to most of what I've done on my university faculty webpage at Cambridge. Various other scholarly. I confess that perhaps it's my age, that I'm not as savvy about promoting my work on, through social media and other electronic mediums such as the one we are doing today. And I'm more sort of an old-fashioned kind of researcher who publishes through academic presses, etc., and websites. And so that would be probably the most convenient place to find.
Yeah, I will link it onto the episode anyway. But I mean, can I just say, you for this medium, you absolutely nailed it. You come across really well. You present a really balanced, discussion. So I think we should see more of you on this kind of medium, because I think you do a great job. So thank you again for joining me. I've enjoyed speaking to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.